Remember last time I said we'll see what happens until next Wednesday? Well, a lot of things happened. Uh, okay. First off,
China, an oasis of calm
yeah,
in the midst
exactly.
of all of this. I mean, it really is. I mean,
Yes.
it's the one place which is stable, still stable. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. Yeah. And China has been trying pretty hard to keep it that way. So I think
Yeah.
there has not been any really calm. There has been provocations. So that hasn't
Yeah.
stopped, I think, but China
Yeah.
has been handling it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, let's start with talking about China. How do you feel about the pick, Tim Walz, Harris running mate? What I feel like they are trying to counter JD Vance because he's come from the Midwest, kind of come from countryside, that kind of thing. Just so you know, China actually paid attention to him because he has some China Connect. And
Ah,
yeah, so just to share with you, you might find that interesting.
I
So
didn't know this.
yeah, as early as 1989, he actually spent a year in China teaching high school, I think, teaching English.
Oh,
And then later, when he got married in 1994, he spent his honeymoon in China.
mhm,
And then I think his wife and him also involved. They have been running a company that they organize high schoolers go visit China in the summer. So they have
mhm,
done that for decades, for a long time.
mhm,
So he has visited China many times. Now he never claimed he speaks Chinese, but from time to time when he became governor, he did say Happy New Year to in Cantonese to the
mhm,
Chinese community, I guess,
mhm,
etc. But also when he was in the House, he was in the committee, in the House committee related to China, and he did co-sponsor some bills to criticize China of human rights, violations, and
mhm,
urge China, put pressure on China to release dissidents, etc. Those kind of same
mhm,
same script that we are very familiar with. But he was the co-sponsor. I paid attention to that. He wasn't taking initiative himself. It seems to me. So it could
yeah,
be he's under the pressure. Could be that just that's the way the consensus are in Washington, whatever.
mm.
So with that, I think that's the reason people in China did pay attention, and that's when I read it, in the Chinese media. With
Well,
all
that
that,
yeah,
with
go.
all that, do you think he could be a China moderate, or am I too optimistic?
No, no, you're not being optimistic. I mean, it does seem as if he generally likes the country and has a real connection to it. The fact that he's chose to go there with his wife after they married, the fact that he spent a whole year there, the fact that he's maintained all of these contacts for such a long time, suggests that looking at somebody who, at some level, actually likes China quite a lot. And I wouldn't put too much into the fact that he's co-sponsored these bills. The fact is that the very fact that he's got these connections with China is going to make him a very suspicious person for some people. They're going to say, well, is this really somebody we can trust and is reliable? And so, for that reason, in order to buy himself insurance and to get himself some cover from the kind of attacks that one can expect, he goes ahead and co sponsors these sort of bills. I'm afraid that's the sort of price you have to pay to be a political figure in Washington nowadays. So, yes, I would actually treat this as a good sign. And it might reinforce some glimmers of feeling that there exist that a possible Kamala Harris administration might be prepared to take steps to shift American foreign policy in some way. I mean, the other reason why Tim Walz has been picked, rather than the person that everybody thought would be picked, which was beginning to harden that it was going to be Josh Shapiro. Shapiro, after all, is the governor of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is an important state in the election. The Democrats need to win it. And he was the person who many expected would be able to deliver Pennsylvania to Harris. Well, I think the reason they picked Waltz over Shapiro again comes down to foreign policy, which is that Shapiro is seen as being too close to Israel. And at a time when there's real problems within the Democratic Party about the relationship, the very close ties that the US government, the Biden administration has had to Israel. Um, that's, I think, the primary reason why they decided to, skip
Mhm.
Shapiro and go for Walz. So, but they will have known when they made the pick that Walz has this connection to China. And, it may be that they are finally looking to try and moderate their foreign policies in some way, and that is what they're going to do. But of course, the problem with the United States is that political leaders emerge there, they gain high office, one attaches hopes to them, one is optimistic about what they will do, and then it all ends in crushing disappointment because the forces that seek confrontation ultimately invariably turn out to be too strong and invariably come out and win. And that we've seen that play out time and again. I remember with Obama, I remember with, when Trump came in, he said he'd
Um,
improve relations with Russia. I mean, so, one shouldn't, it's a slender twig to place any reliance on an American politician, especially when he's not going to be the president, he's only going to be the vice president. So one mustn't put too much hope in this.
yeah, because in the same time, people are discussing about this. They were talking about the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, from Iowa, right? And he also is being regarded as a moderate. He was also, I think, he was trying to improve the relationship, in particular trade, stuff like that. In the end, but that was under Trump, and we all know
Mm.
Trump probably himself trying to get along, but in the end he was pretty much
Yeah,
controlled by the Pompeo,
yeah,
but sidelined by Pompeo. And so Terry Branstad basically resigned because he just couldn't continue this very weird kind of, on the one hand, he's trying to do
mm,
something, but always sidelined by Pompeo. And of course, it got really bad after they kidnapped Meng Wanzhou. All that kind of thing became impossible for
yeah,
him to continue his own way of doing things. So that's in the end he resigned. That's how people interpreted in China why he left, because he didn't have trouble with the Chinese leader in China. China liked him. So
yeah.
but that's pretty much, yeah, what you're saying. Yes.
Well, this is exactly so. I mean, the same, happens with the current director of the CIA, Bill Burns. He was
Uh-huh.
apparently he was U.S. ambassador to Moscow. The Russians liked him very much. They thought he was a person they could talk to. He seemed interested in what they were saying to him. He was a successful and effective diplomat by all
Hmm.
accounts. We know from WikiLeaks that he was sending good and wise and correct
Yeah.
warnings to Washington about American foreign policy. But in the end, it all amounted to nothing. So, it's exactly the same. One can't, unfortunately, place reliance on people, individuals.
Individuals.
There
Yeah.
has to be a fundamental shift in the mood in the United States, and it might be the fact that people like Waltz are emerging. Even the fact that Vance is emerging might be
Mhm.
straws in the wind, but one shouldn't place any reliance on them at the moment. And for what it's worth, I have to say that my impression anyway is that the neocon tendency is even stronger in the Democratic Party at the moment than it is in the Republican one, which is saying something.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think one person probably won't make much of a difference,
Mm,
however important that person, the position really is. But yeah, you're right. The neocons always get their way, and they don't have a
mm,
reverse gear. They
mm,
just keep on making things worse when things doesn't go
mm,
their way. So that's how it
mm.
has been, yeah, play out all the time. Yes. What's going on in Britain? Can you give me, is
What is
multiple
going
places?
on?
Yeah, go ahead.
well, let me say first of all that I just there's a lot of things to explain here. Firstly, I think there's a point which many people outside Britain are not aware of, which is that um, in Britain, rioting in August is actually a fairly regular thing. I mean, I'm not saying it happens every year, but it happens quite often in August that you get riots and disturbances and all kinds of things happen. So, in a sense that we're getting riots now, it isn't that surprising. I think a lot of people have this idea that Britain is a very orderly and law-abiding and peaceful country. It is in some ways, but not in others. And there's a long-standing history of rioting in Britain and unrest and protests in cities. So I think there's that to say. The second is that despite the impressions that you might be getting from the media, including the British media, the rioting this year has not been particularly extensive. I've been doing checks with various people I know. I've checked the local media up and down the country. The vast most of Britain is quiet. I mean, there are protests in some places, but they're not that widespread. The third thing to say is that what was the trigger of the protests was a very, very ugly and horrible murder carried out in a town called Southport, in which three young people were, were, were stabbed to death. Now, again, and I've worked in the justice system myself. I can tell you that this isn't uncommon either. It's very common in Britain when there's a violent murder which captures the public imagination, especially one which involves children, in which children are killed, that you suddenly see an outburst of anger and violence, and people come out onto the streets and start doing things of that kind. So all of this is, none of this is that different from the standard, but there are differences this time. The first and the most important difference by far is that the British government, Keir Starmer's government, instead of trying to calm the situation, is inflaming it. They're making out that these protests are taking place on a much bigger scale than they are. Now that's bizarre if you think about it. It's not usual for governments to come around and give the whole world the impression that Britain is going up in flames when it isn't. I mean that's not what governments generally do, but it is what this particular government is doing. And it is also, and not without some cause, by the way, playing up the role of what they call the far right in these protests, by which they mean fascist, racist people who undoubtedly exist in Britain in significant numbers, especially in England, and who are to some extent part of these protests. And that there's no doubt at all that some of these protests are being directed against immigrant groups and things of that kind. But what the government is doing is, again, it's giving the impression that this racist element in British society is very large and very powerful and very dangerous. Well, to be frank, I don't think it is. And I don't think the actual scale of the protests is such as would make you think that it is, even if one assumed that all of these protesters and rioters were indeed far right and racist and right wing and all of that kind of thing, which, by the way, I'm not convinced they are. I mean, a lot of them are just young people, boys, who are not going to school because it's the August holidays and do what a lot of English boys do, which is drink a lot on the hot days and go out and riot. I mean, this is unfortunately very common if you've lived in England. So, I mean, a lot of that is what is going on here. And I think the government is doing this because they have an agenda, which is that they want to create this impression within British society that the country is deeply divided, that there's a large ultra right, far right fascist forces building up their strength across Britain, that they're a major danger and that somehow justifies the various other repressive moves that the government wants to take, tightening up on social media, increasing censorship, increasing surveillance, limiting the rights of protest, doing a lot of that kind of thing. And I think this rhetoric is partly intended both to mobilize people on the center and the left in Britain who are very disappointed with this government that we have at the moment, which is promising more of the same, basically. So I think they want to mobilize them and to unite them behind the government. Oh, that's one part of the strategy. And the other is that they want to advance this much more restrictive agenda than the one we've seen up to now. And I think that's probably coming as well. So I don't want to give the impression that there are no protests and there is no rioting going on. That wouldn't be true.
Mhm.
And I certainly don't want to give the impression that there aren't any far right, extreme, racist, unpleasant, horrible, wicked people in Britain, because there absolutely are. But I do think that this affair is being manipulated in ways that I find rather concerning.
Just so the other thing that when people are reading what's going on in Britain, they
Mm,
always like to use this phrase, "a beautiful sight to behold." Now, this is Nancy Pelosi's description when Hong Kong riot happened. So ever
mm,
since that, this has been used whenever there's a January 6th or any protest in the
yeah,
Western countries. People will say, oh, "Okay, another beautiful sight to behold." Still, just so you know. I think the US has done similar things. They
yeah,
make it like a January 6th, they make it such a big deal. I mean,
yeah,
January 6th by and large has been peaceful. I mean, the
yeah,
person being killed is a protest, right? But they make it such a big deal. They prosecuted everybody, etc.
yeah,
I think they pretty much what you're saying, they have an agenda, I believe. And the same thing with the campus protest or the students protest, I think
yeah,
also very peaceful.
yeah,
If you look at Columbia University, the students, they did exactly what the rule says. They find a place that allowed them to do so.
yeah,
And then they protest there. But then the school is still very brought in the police, etc. They make it and they call it anti-Semitic, which is
yeah,
not true. The people there are protesting the Israeli government for genocide. They are not really focusing, targeting particular ethnicities, but they are being portrayed as such. So I think that they are pretty much doing the same thing as you were saying. I do think that the government has an agenda when actually in reality it's not as bad as it is, but they make it bigger deal so that they can justify their authoritarian method. Is that overall that's
yeah,
what
yeah,
you
yeah,
think?
you're absolutely right, and the parallels with the United States are very striking. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think they play out. It plays out exactly in the way that you said. And notice, of course, and it's a good point that you mentioned the Colombia protests, because this is protest both on the left and on the right that is
Hmm.
being suppressed. The
Yeah.
same, by the way, is true in Britain. There's also been a big attempt to talk up supposed lawless behavior
Hmm.
by people who are protesting what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. And those protests have been completely peaceful in
Yeah.
Britain. My wife has attended a few, by the way, just saying. So, and nonetheless, if you were to judge from what the authorities have been saying about them and certain newspapers have been saying about them, you would imagine that, again, it was all, extreme left,
Uh-huh.
Islamic, all kind of radicals, ISIS type people running the mob in London, and by the way, just on the point of the violence, no one has died in these protests.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's no there's not been a single person. There's not been a single fatality. There's
Hmm.
been a certain amount of property damage. A mosque in Southport was set on fire. Terrible,
Hmm.
shocking, outrageous things. But again, to repeat a point I made before, if you know some of these cities where these things happen, the big industrial cities, this isn't that rare. I mean, summer is, as I said, a time when riots happen quite regularly in England.
Mhm.
We may appear to be an orderly and law-abiding people, but especially young people, quite often are not.
Yeah. It's interesting because in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, that there were a lot of clashes and you can say violence and
Mm,
people like Malcolm X, right? That he made it
yeah,
very clear, that peaceful protest is not going to work. So you have to be, using violence and sometimes and justified. And of course, he got killed.
mm.
And then the government, I think the US government got scared. So they pushed forward this peaceful message. So they think Martin Luther King is the good guy because he's peaceful, right? So they feel like they could handle as long as you're peaceful. But now there seems like they're even afraid of the peaceful protest now. They
Well,
feel like
indeed.
they cannot control that even. It seems to
But
me.
that's exactly right. I mean, they don't. I mean, the thing, the ultimate explanation for the not for the riots themselves, but for the government's reaction to them, is that the government and the political class in Britain are very insecure. We've
Uh-huh.
discussed
Mhm.
this in previous programs.
Yeah.
We saw that with the election, where turnout was incredibly low by British standards. We've seen this in the way in which the government achieved a lopsided election result with an enormous majority based on the votes of just a fifth of the British voters. And the Conservative Party at the same time has collapsed. The Liberal Party is popular. There's never been a time when the British elite has felt less secure.
Hmm.
Never. Not
Hmm.
at any point in its modern history, going all the way back to the 17th century. So this nervousness is expressing itself in the way in which they respond to events which, you know, once upon a time, not that long ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, well, they would have achieved a certain degree of coverage, obviously in Britain, because riots always do, but not the kind of incredible coverage that they do today.
Hmm.
And with, the enormously fraught language that is used about these protests, which is absolutely not the case previously.
Yeah. And the one place that Bangladesh actually is having a pretty significant riot, but they always describe that as democracy wins, right? When
Yeah.
when the prime minister, I don't know if she first landed in India, but I heard that she's heading to Britain, will ended up
Mm.
in London or something. We don't know,
That doesn't
but anyway,
surprise me. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the prime minister left. The Chinese media actually in January, when they first had election, when she won, there was already articles saying that the West are going to have a color revolution
Yeah.
because she's being regarded as a pro-China, helping China with the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. Is that your take on that?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. I mean, I should say that the thing to understand about Hashima, the leader of the now ousted leader of Bangladesh, is that she's the daughter of Bangladesh's independence leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and she represents a current in Bangladeshi politics that has always sought Bangladeshi independence, good relations with India, certainly, because India played a critical role in helping Bangladesh to become independent, but also has taken a negative view generally of the United States. I mean, because the US previously supported the government of Pakistan that her father rebelled against. And the United States, by the way, also backed the coup. There was a military coup that overthrew her father, Mujibur Rahman, and he was actually killed. So
Mm-hmm.
there is all this history. And she's been a long standing, and as far as I can see, popular leader, and
Mm-hmm.
in some ways a successful one. Bangladesh remains an extremely poor country,
Yeah.
but it has experienced a certain level of economic growth. It needs to develop its economy. It's got major need for heavy investment in the economy to change it from what it is at the moment, which is basically a country that makes a cheap um, clothing goods for
Mm.
Western consumers. A lot of your T-shirts are made in Bangladesh now, and that kind of thing. So there needs to be a major program for economic development and industrialization. The only country in the world that has the resources and the interest to help Bangladesh do that is China. And of course, that was the policy that she was trying to develop. And of course, that means that the Americans automatically are deeply suspicious of her. It also means that there are elements within Bengali society, Bangladeshi society, which will be suspicious of her too, because they're aligned with the United States. Many of the interests that want to keep Bangladesh into the world, basically to maintain it as the world's biggest sweatshop. They want to keep it like that. So that's why you have the coup, because that's what
Yeah.
this is. It's a coup.
And it looks familiar, isn't it? It's always
Yeah,
looks
yeah,
familiar, just
yeah,
like Venezuela, right?
yeah.
They're still working there. I mean, they're still
Oh,
trying
yeah.
to, yeah. Now, I also read that the US is ready to sanction India. Is that so? They have been back and forth with India. They're trying to pull the back to get India on their side, but India is too independent, I guess. The
Yes.
latest in the Chinese media are talking about is that there is a meeting. Blinken called in, I think, Australia, India, and Japan or somebody. There were four countries, and during that meeting, there's Blinken trying to divide India from China, saying, okay, you border problem, we should help you to resolve it or whatever. But the Indian foreign minister said, well, that's something between us and China. We can resolve it among ourselves. We don't need other
Yeah.
outsiders to get involved. And apparently Blinken was shocked by
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah. Well, I know it's shock. The West has always develops these ideas that countries that don't get on with China hate China, and that this is somehow a long-standing historic thing that India and China are always fated to be adversaries. They thought exactly the same about China and Russia. Till a couple of years ago, I mean, I wrote a piece for the Duran, by the way, because then we were just a website in 2015, in which I spoke about the fact that this relationship, this friendship between China and Russia that was developing then was real. It was not. It was not. It was not what some people were saying, an alliance of convenience, that China and Russia were frenemies. I said, that on the contrary, you actually look at what is really happening. This is real. This is actually a real development. And I said that again, a point we've made previously on our programs. People are not looking at the whole history of Chinese Russian relations. They look at one period in the 1960s and early 1970s and assume that this is typical of the relationship as a whole. And it isn't. Now, if you go to the relationship between India and China, that is true
mhm,
orders of magnitude more. I mean, China and India have had interactions for thousands of years, and generally they've been friendly. I mean, Chinese Buddhists have traveled to India.
yeah. Mhm,
We discussed, the journey to the West in our
mhm.
previous program. That was all about a
Yes,
Chinese person going to India.
India, yeah.
There's been huge interactions between China and India, and there was even a period which people also forget in the 1950s when China and India were very good friends. In fact, again, at that time, many people thought that they were actually allies.
Mm,
And there was talk that Bandit Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, and Zhou Enlai were actual friends, and it looked for a
Mhm.
time as if they were. And then what happened was, and this is where the problem has always been, that the Americans and to some extent the British have been able to play to some extent on Indian insecurity and
Mhm.
vanity and jealousy of the fact that China seems to be getting ahead. And that was what led to the crisis in the 1960s. And it's what's kept the tensions going between China and India ever since. But it's not something that is fated to be. In fact, it makes no sense. It makes no sense for India to be an adversary of China. And I think fundamentally, if you speak with Indian diplomats, I know three, by the way, including,
Mhm.
well, two ambassadors and one very senior diplomat, they will tell you this. They will say that, ultimately our priority has to be to repair our relations with China. We got
Mhm.
ourselves into this bad situation with China back in the 1960s when we made a whole series of mistakes. But Nehru made lots of mistakes. He destroyed what had up to then been a very good relationship. He thought that he could somehow extend Indian influence into Tibet, which is a crazy idea, and
Mhm.
started supporting the Dalai Lama of all people. I mean, don't get me started on the Dalai Lama, that India needs to find its way back from that, and they will do so, because India today is gradually regaining its confidence. It's now sensing that it is a rising country, and um, as a rising country, it understands that improving its relations with China, normalizing its relations with China, will give India that room for maneuver that will enable it to play its full role as, a rising great power. Whereas with the Americans, if it sticks with the Americans or gets too close with the Americans, the relationship with the Americans can never be an equal one,
Mhm.
because the Americans will never accept anybody as an equal. So that's the story. I mean,
Isn't that? I would love to be hiding in that room, looking at Blinken's expression when
yeah,
when
absolutely.
India's foreign ministers tell him basically mind your own business. We can take care of this.
Well, I know. I mean, this is again. I've argued, just as I used to argue with people about China and Russia. I, I've had so many arguments with people here in Britain about this thing that, oh no, you don't understand what you're talking about. There's no way India will ever have a rapprochement with China. That is impossible. They hate the Chinese. They're afraid of the Chinese. They need us to protect them from the Chinese. Justin, you don't know what you're talking about. You really don't. I mean, and they don't. I mean, but because this situation of Chinese Indian antagonism suits them, they think it will last forever.
Mhm. Yeah.
This is such a nihilistic approach to diplomacy. Keep China and India at odds with each other.
Mhm.
Play up all the time the antagonism of them. Tell the Indians, "Look, you can't really get close to the Chinese. You mustn't trust them. They're dangerous." All that sort of thing. Um, this isn't the way one should conduct diplomacy in the modern
Mhm.
modern world. One should try and avoid tensions, reduce tensions, not increase them. The Indians, in the end, are not going to thank the Americans for trying to keep them in conflict with their biggest and oldest neighbor.
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
going to they're going to they're going to be resentful of the Americans for doing that. By the way, again, I know lots of people from India. They are already. The Indians are clever enough to work out what the Americans are up to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why there's rumor. It seems like a serious that the U.S. is thinking of sanction India, even though I
Yeah,
think sanction is getting less and less effective, but
yeah.
they will
Well,
not stop.
Well, they will not. I mean, it's a crazy idea, and I mean, already apparently they've sanctioned a third of the countries in the
And
world. 60% of world trade apparently is now affected by sanctions in some form. There's even a report apparently in the US saying that this is becoming increasingly counterproductive, but they're just going to go on doing it because that's what they do.
yeah, yeah. All right, the Middle East. Okay,
Mm.
there's so many things going on, right? I'm trying to. I wonder if
Yeah,
you can
yeah,
sort this through. So here are the things. Okay, Israel. There's rumor. I mean, there's a report saying Israel could preemptively strike Iran.
yeah,
We're still waiting for Iran, so I mean, revenge. But and then Lindsey Graham. Okay, Lindsey Graham being Lindsey Graham introduced a war power bill to strike
yeah,
Iran's nuclear program. I mean, nuclear or not, the bill is basically saying to strike Iran.
yeah,
He introduced that bill, and their aircraft carrier is heading to the Middle East, if not already there. And several countries have been urging their citizens to leave Lebanon and other places in Middle East. At the same time, there's also a report saying the U.S. has sent delegations to Tehran to try to diffuse the tension.
yeah,
Now, it has not been confirmed by the State Department. I haven't seen it, but
yeah,
there's a report about that. And Shoigu now is also visiting in Tehran,
yeah.
supposedly brought with him some heavy weapons as well.
Mm.
So, can you sort through what is going on there right
This is exactly the classic situation that American diplomacy produces. So they are completely 100% committed to Israel. This has been the standard rhetoric that the United States has been engaged in for decades. They have an alliance with Israel. They have supported Israel in every outrage and crime that Israel has committed over the last 10 months in Gaza. In fact, the crimes in Gaza are getting worse and worse. This has resulted in an enormous um, global backlash against Israel, obviously, but also against the United States, because the United States is supporting all of these horrors. So the United States, which has become increasingly embarrassed, has tried over the last few weeks, very ineffectively, to try to persuade the Israelis to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And the Israelis do not want a ceasefire in Gaza, or to be more precise, the Israeli government does not want a ceasefire in Gaza. So, as they come under increasing pressure from the Americans to have a ceasefire in Gaza, they've acted to make that impossible by murdering Hamas's chief negotiator, which is what Haniyeh was, the man they've just killed in Tehran. He was Iran Hamas's chief negotiator, negotiating with the Israelis through the good offices of the Americans to try and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. So they murdered him, and they murdered him in Tehran in the government guest house there, the equivalent of planting a bomb or launching a missile strike on Dayutai. Yeah, I mean that kind of thing.
now?
And this directly after Netanyahu goes to Congress, makes a speech in which he talks about Iran wants war with Iran. That the United States and Israel should stand together and fight Iran, and if they do, well, they will win. He gets 58 standing ovations from Congress after he talks in that way. And as I said, that's why we are where we are. So there are some people in the United States, powerful people, many of them, who want a war with Iran. They've wanted a war with Iran for as long as I can remember. They've been obsessed with Iran. Um, there is a prime minister in Israel and a government which is led by religious extremists, because that's what some of them are. People like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, these people who want to reestablish the temple and all of that. They're losing the war in Gaza. They are under pressure from the Americans to agree a ceasefire. They would regard that as a major defeat. So they act with their friends in Washington to stop any possibility of ceasefire by killing the other side's chief negotiator. And they do it in such a way as to force the Iranians into a strong reaction, which they hope will then lead to that all-out war with Iran that they have been wanting all along. So that's the basic setup.
Mhm.
Now, the Americans, of course, and when I say the Americans, bear in mind there are many factions in the United States.
Mhm.
The dominant faction within the administration and the Democratic Party are horrified by all of this. They do not want an expansion of the war in the Middle East. They understand how disastrous that would be for the overall position of the United States. After all, they've been trying to get a ceasefire negotiated in Gaza. So they're trying to stop an all out war in the Middle East. But they can't criticize Israel because in the United States that is politically impossible
Mhm.
because for decades the US has been saying that they will stand with Israel no matter what. They can't take any action to restrain Israel, even though it's clear that it is Israel that is the aggressor and the main driver in these events. So what do? Instead, they ask Iran to show restraint. Iran has been showing restraint ever since October,
Yeah.
but it
Mhm.
is being asked to show even more restraint, even as the Netanyahu government shows no restraint at all. So the Americans are addressing their requests for restraint to the wrong party. The Iranians will say, well, look, we showed lots of restraint.
Yeah.
And what has it got for us? The Israelis continue to attack us. Surely, if you want to talk your message of restraint, you should be addressing it to the Israelis and not to us. But that is not something that this very complicated political situation in the United States will ever allow.
And in the meantime, Netanyahu is not going to stop, right? I mean, they're
No,
talking about the preemptive strike now,
that's
which
right.
means before Iran does anything, they might strike again.
Yeah, of
And
course.
the Netanyahu also said because Hamas had got a new leader, and they said you're the next. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not going to stop, right?
No, no, which of course they're putting all that out. First of all, again, to make it crystal clear to the Iranians that because they want the war with Iran. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the thing to understand. They want the war with Iran, so they're telling the Iranians, well, don't pay any attention to what the Americans are telling you. We're going to come after you anyway. I mean, we're going to go on coming after you. So, and of course, if there is any possibility that the Iranians do show restraint, well, we're going to launch a preemptive strike in order to attack them. Uh, it is absolutely clear. This is the important thing to understand. Which is the side that is destabilizing the situation in the Middle East, creating war and chaos there, killing people in the most outrageous way. Killing people is wrong anyway, but killing people in an absolutely outrageous way, carrying out a genocide in Gaza, doing extraordinary tortures in other places on the West Bank and wherever. And yet, it's not they who are being asked to show
Mhm.
restraint. It's the other side to whom they're doing it. So if this absurdity continues, we will eventually end up in a war because the side that wants the war is not being told to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as simple as that.
And it's also going back to the question we talked so many times about the sovereignty, right? Country seems like the hardest thing for any country is to have their own sovereignty, has an independent foreign policy.
Yeah,
Even the United States, it seems to me, like have a very difficult independence because they are controlled by the deep state, by the APAC, by big corporations like with their foreign policies. We just talked about China. Even people, moderate people, wants to have a good relationship with China, with Russia. Doesn't seem they can
no,
do it. It's
no,
not like there's no people in the United States have the right mind, but these are the people being sidelined. Nobody is listening to them. They don't have the real power. And with Israel, the same thing. I'm sure there are also people who, like a Thomas Massey kind of a people, do not think this is make much sense. But of
mm,
course, nobody listened to him. So Israel just keep on going, doing all these things and continue to try, at least trying to pull the US into the Middle East, which doesn't make any sense for the United States, right? But
But it doesn't make any sense with the United States. You're absolutely correct. But there doesn't seem to be any way of shifting American foreign policy to a position of sanity and moderation. Whenever the attempt is made, all the forces that want things to continue as they are, taking the United States in the wrong direction, reassemble and stop any movement, to shift policy and to bring it back to a correct direction. And by the way, you're absolutely right about Israel as well. There are a lot of people in Israel who are very unhappy with the way things are going. Now, there was a very interesting article yesterday in the Financial Times in which apparently a whole group of military officers and security officials had a meeting last week with Netanyahu. And they said, look, this isn't working. We're not winning the war in Gaza. The army is exhausted. The people are unhappy. The economy is going badly wrong. We're becoming diplomatically isolated. We have got to stop. We've got to get a ceasefire. It's in our interests to get a ceasefire. We've got to get our people released. And Netanyahu apparently got furious and he called them weaklings. And he said, you're not under any circumstances going to put any kind of pressure on me. And he's able to do that because the Americans back him. Ultimately, he knows that the Americans back him. And of course, within Israel itself, there's all sorts of hardline figures who are in control of the principal levers of power. And they back that stance too. So, despite the fact that there's lots of people who know that this is wrong, there doesn't seem to be any way of changing
it. Both the US and Israel seems like the sound voice, the people who are saying doesn't seem to have control, so.
No. Yeah.
Another place is, of course, Ukraine. There's something interesting about this prison swap. I don't know if you paid attention.
Yeah.
So there are on the numbers, so there are 15 supposedly
Yeah.
Russians, one Belarusian, they from Russia, from Belarus, going to US and Germany. And then there are 8 of them from US going, and another European countries going to Russia. But when you look closely, the 15 people going to US and Germany, majority of them are Russians. They are Russian dissident, and some of them are, quite a few of them are in the Moni group, right?
Yeah.
So these are Russian dissident and Russian, I guess, just the people Russian didn't like, and some of them being sentenced to treason, etc. And then they are, and then from the US, they are Russians, they are going back to Russia. So out of the 12, the 15, I think only 2 are really real US citizens. In the meantime, they are actually continue to have more US citizens still staying in Russia. Among others, there's this guy, Mark Fogel, who's a teacher. He was sentenced to 14 years because of he had some canopies, which doesn't seem like a very significant crime. But I guess Russia, just like China, anything related to drugs is a very sensitive thing. But the US government doesn't try to get him back to the US. Instead, it seems working hard to get those Russians out of Russia. Isn't that odd?
Well, I'll tell you what I think, and I can't prove this, but I'll be very straightforward. I think all of these people are spies. I think every single one of them are spies of various kinds. I think this has been a complicated negotiation that has been carried out by the various intelligence agencies. So these were various American Russians who were receiving money from the US and who were doing various things on American instructions. Maybe they weren't exactly spies in the sense that perhaps they weren't going out there to actually obtain secrets. But, the United States, as we know, is very good at running cells and agitation in various countries. So I think this is what all of these people were. They were basically people who were funded and operated by the various intelligence services. The Russians who returned to Russia, the Russians who the Russians brought back, were clearly people who had worked for their intelligence and security
mm,
services.
mm,
And I think that this is true of all of the others as well. I think that, every one of them, and there's some big names there, I mean, people I've heard of,
mm.
but I suspect that they were all people who, one way or another, were on, the payrolls of one of the many alphabet agencies in the United States, and that this is what this was all about, and this is what explains the mystery that you've been mentioning. Navalny, by the way, was supposed to be one of them, which,
Oh, okay.
if my supposition is correct, um, um, you know, um, answers some important questions about him.
Well, yeah, well then it makes sense. So other Americans who are still in Russia, because they're not spies. That's why they
Exactly.
have no
Well, exactly.
values.
Exactly. They have
They
no
have no
value.
value.
So somebody, goes to Russia, gets caught up in, in cannabis possession or dealing or something of that kind. If they got no connection to the US authorities, then the Americans will just wash their hands of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's good to know that your government don't care much about you. Okay. Um, and then also Ukraine, they host the oil delivery to Slovakia and
Yeah.
Hungary. Supposedly, the EU knew about this. So, if that's true, the EU would just punish its. I mean, Hungary are in the EU, right? So EU are punishing its own people. I mean,
Yeah.
these are oil just going to Hungary for civilians, etc. Uh, what are they doing? Or what does that gain? What do they achieve by doing this?
Well, if what the Hungarians are telling us is true, then it's even worse than you've said, because the Hungarians say that it wasn't the Ukrainians who decided to cut the oil off; it was the EU. The EU went to the Ukrainians and said, "Stop the oil supplies to Hungary and Slovakia." Now, bear in mind, Hungary and Slovakia were importing oil from Russia because the EU had itself given them an exemption to
Mm,
import oil from Russia.
mhm,
And the EU gave them that exemption in return for Hungary and Slovakia lifting their threat to sanction, to veto
mhm.
EU sanctions prohibiting the
Okay.
import into the EU of oil from Russia. So it suggests incredible bad faith. It suggests, on the one hand, the EU, um, um, as you absolutely rightly say, sanctioning its own countries. I mean, because that's what
Yeah.
it is effectively, acting to sanction and punish its own countries, and going back on its word to these countries. And it tells you an awful lot, I think, about the kind of institution that the EU has become.
Yeah, but what's the EU's thinking? This is something I got very confused because I remember when I was in Sweden, they had a referendum about whether Sweden should join EU, and it was very controversial. It was I can slightly over 50% in the end,
Mm,
because a lot of people I thought at the time I thought that was pretty straightforward. You get to access a bigger market, more
mm,
collaborations, so that's good. But lots of people very skeptical. Turns out they probably are right because you look at
mm,
what EU is doing now. If I were the one who run the EU project, I would want the people living in the EU countries, people, to be happy, right? I want
yeah,
them to feel beneficiary that they live in the EU. But what they're doing now is punishing Slovakia or Hungary. I mean, first of all, of course, that make these countries and the people very unhappy. But it also shows other countries like if you don't do things I want you to do, I can punish you. What kind of message are they sending?
well, it's a terrible message, but you're thinking again very much, if I forgive me saying so, like a Chinese person. But that is not the political culture in Europe. Never has been. In Europe, as I said before, in many of our programs, we are obsessed with power. Power is the actual exercise. Well, not just power, but dominance. And the EU, which started as a very beneficial and, in my opinion, well conceived and proper economic project to bring the various parts of the European economy together, to facilitate trade, to facilitate movement of people between EU countries, to basically do things that would not only secure prosperity in Europe, but which would secure peace in Europe, has gradually morphed into a political project. And political projects in Europe are always about power and about control and about dominance. So if you are the European Commission, you're seeing Hungary and Slovakia, they're coming out quite openly criticizing and contradicting the policies of the EU centre. So the result is they must be punished and must be brought into line, even if doing so violates EU promises and EU regulations, which it almost certainly does, by the way.
Yeah. And then also, Ukraine is attacking
Yeah,
Russian territory again. Okay,
yeah,
they didn't go very far, but they are doing that.
yeah,
That's to me is escalation there as well.
yeah.
That they also trying to get the NATO, the US get in. Is that what they're doing?
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, this is again the situation that we have because um, they're losing the war. I think everybody now can see that they are losing the war. They themselves have been trying to, we discussed it again in recent programs. They've been trying to set up a negotiating process to freeze the war. They spoke to China. They sent Kuleba to China. He met Wang Yi. I think it was in Guangdong, by the way. I thought it was in Beijing, but I think he actually met him in Guangdong. Um, I think Wang Yi found that Kuleba wasn't really prepared to talk in a particularly rational way about how to end the war. But they want to end the war. But at the same time, they're not prepared to make any compromises. And so they start these military operations. And the narrative that is being spun in Kiev, and which they're apparently giving to the West, is that they're doing all of these things in order to strengthen their negotiating position in advance of talks with the Russians, which they expect is going to happen before the end of the year. When all that is actually going to do is it going to infuriate the Russians and make the Russians even more skeptical that Ukraine, under its present government, is a party with which there's any point in negotiating at all. So it's actually going to make negotiations more difficult. It's going to result in another front being opened at a time when Ukraine is losing on all of the others and when its army is short of every conceivable resource. But it's what the Ukrainians do. They won't they won't accept reality, face reality, and sit down and talk peace. Instead, they come up with all kinds of schemes and plots and plans. They're going to attack Russia and capture a small town on the border. They're going to attack the nuclear power station in Zaporozhye. They're going to play the Chinese off against the Russians. They're going to do one thing after another, but they're not going to do the one thing that really could help them, which is pick up the phone. It can't be done to Moscow directly because the Russians might not pick up the phone in return, but they pick up the phone, call maybe Beijing, maybe someone else, and say, please pass on to the Russians that we are prepared to talk and we are serious about it. And tell us where we can meet so that we're getting a negotiating team together. And if we meet there, this time we will be negotiating seriously and in good faith. That's the one thing they're not prepared to do.
Yeah, and then I think the NATO's they're not making things better. They just a few weeks ago didn't United States and Germany they announced that they are going to start deploying long-range weapons in Germany. Now it's planned in 2026, so we don't know what's going to happen. But
Yeah.
the fact is that the things that they said they're going to deploy, including hypersonic missiles, which I think is currently under development, but eventually can carry a 100 kiloton nuclear warhead. That's
Yeah.
very provocative, isn't it?
Oh, it's not just incredibly provocative, it is potentially extremely dangerous. Now, we did a program on the Duran with Theodore Postol, who is a professor at MIT, and he's a rocket scientist and somebody who worked in the Pentagon. In fact, he's not just a rocket scientist, he's one of the America's best rocket scientists. And he said this is unbelievably dangerous because it means that because we're talking about hypersonic weapons, if they're launched from Germany, they can reach Moscow, and the Russians would only have 2 minutes warning that they would come. So the Russians inevitably are going to take precautions. They're going to do one of two things. Firstly, they will be prepared to deal with these missiles preemptively. So if there is a period of extreme international tension, such as the Russians might think could lead to war, they would be under a lot of pressure to act preemptively to destroy these missiles before these missiles can be launched against their capital. So that is already one very dangerous thing. And the second thing that this could lead to is even more dangerous, is that it could lead to the Russians, in fact, it will lead to the Russians taking decisions to disperse their decision making because they will know that in 2 minutes' time there isn't sufficient time for the political leadership to make a decision about how to respond to an attack like this. So they will give their commanders around Russia, the missile commanders with all the nuclear weapons, they will say to them, these are the protocols. If Moscow is attacked and destroyed and the political leadership is killed, you should react in this way. You should take decisions by yourself to respond. And we could find ourselves in an all out nuclear exchange very quickly without anybody, in effect, making decisions. It is crazy to do this. The Americans, however, the Pentagon has been trying to do this for decades. They tried this for the first time in the early 1960s when they installed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, um, provoking the Cuban Missile Crisis. They did this again in the early 1980s when they tried to install Pershing II and Tomahawk missiles in Germany. And that provoked an enormous crisis at that time. And as we now know, brought us very close to nuclear war. And now they're doing it again once more because the Pentagon sees these missile deployments in Europe not as this incredibly dangerous thing that they are, but rather as a means to gain an advantage over the Russians, because it means that the Americans can attack the Russians, giving the Russians less notice than the Americans would get if the Russians attacked them. So it's madness, it's folly, it's incredibly bad, but it's, as I said, something that the Pentagon, it's a bad idea that the Pentagon will not give up.
But how about Germany? Doesn't Germany understand how serious this is? They just never say no to America. I mean,
The, you ask an excellent question because, of course, the Germany that I used to know absolutely did understand it. When the Americans decided to install Pershing and Tomahawk missiles in Germany in the 1980s, there were massive protests. Much of the German political class was strongly opposed, and the protests at that time were led by the Green Party.
mhm.
Now, the Green Party backs these missile deployments. And though when I was in Germany, I found that many people there were very unhappy about what was happening, the political system has become so unresponsive and so unwilling to listen to what ordinary Germans think that most Germans feel very fatalistic. And though they hate what's being done, they don't think that there's anything that can be done to prevent it.
Yeah, and not only that, another thing that got lots of attention in China is that Germany just recently joined the so-called UN Command, which supposedly to uphold this armistice agreement between North and South Korea.
Yeah.
Um, and there's 18 countries, and now Germany just recently joined. Now, whenever the Western country talking about peace, this is
Yeah.
trying to keep peace in the in the Korean Peninsula. I immediately got suspicious. And of course, China paid attention to this, and there were a lot of discussion. What are your take on that? Why is
Well,
Germany doing that?
because it's Germany edging closer to the Pacific region. They're inserting themselves. The German political leadership are inserting Germany into the American Chinese confrontation. So they're taking one little step after another in order to psychologically prepare
They,
German opinion for this. Germany has no interest in what happens on the Korean border. I mean, look at where the Korean border is. Look where Germany is. Why would Germany? I mean, Germany has been perfectly happy not to be involved in it up to now, but now they have to be involved, and they have to be involved not because it's Korea. They're not really interested in Korea as such. Well, the Koreans do compete with them in cars.
Mhm.
I mean, I mean, but because the Americans want them in the Pacific, they want all the Europeans in the Pacific. So that's why the Germans are there. It's as simple as this now. I mean, it's bloc politics coming back with a vengeance.
And as if Germany doesn't have enough problem, right, to deal with, they're agitating Russia and now talking about something really dangerous going on. And the Ukraine war hasn't ended, etc. It's not enough. They have to
No,
start another place. Yeah.
no, and of course they are now apparently entering another recession. I mean, this is the economic figures showed that, by the way, before the events in the markets over the last few days. So Germany's sliding into recession. So is the eurozone. But as you correctly said, we don't have enough problems. We got to have even more problems. So we're going to start getting involved in the armistice issues in Korea, and no doubt find some other way of getting into a confrontation with China in the Pacific. I
Yeah.
mean, th- there is by the way, I ought to say there's been a brilliant speech by the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, about this, in which he talks about Germany, and he actually lists all the things that Olaf Scholz said he wouldn't do,
Mhm.
which he has ended up on American orders doing. And he said it's not because Scholz is an idiot
Mhm.
or anything of that kind. It's because he is not the master of his own or Germany's destinies.
Mhm.
And we can all see that that is so.
Yeah, and those Greens are very hawkish, towards Russia and China, and they are in his government, and so
Yeah.
they're very influential, the Greens. So
Yes, despite being very unpopular now,
yeah.
increasingly unpopular in Germany, which is the great paradox of it. They are very unpopular, but they are in control.
Yeah. Yeah, just like everywhere else, whoever is
Yeah,
unpopular seems always in control.
yeah,
All right, about the stock market, what
yeah,
is your take on that? It seems like it's picking up, like going back a little bit,
yeah,
but the underlying economic numbers are still not good. Is that
yeah.
your take? What is your take?
I look. This is a bit outside my, particular area of knowledge. But I've lived through stock market crashes, going all the way back to '87. I regard this event that we've just had as a, in my, I come from an earthquake zone. Greece is an earthquake zone. China is too. You get before the big earthquake, the first, you know, sign, the big, there's the tremor that comes before the big shock. I think what we've just experienced is the tremor before the
Mhm.
big shock. It's a sign. The markets are signaling that there are problems, that things are not well in the global economy. When I say the global economy, I mean the Western economy. And of course, the epicenter of all this particular problem has been Japan specifically. So this is what the markets are telling us, and of course, Western policymakers are not able to adjust to this because they have no real idea of what to do. So the suggestion is cut interest rates, which might buy you a few weeks or months of time, but only at the price of making things worse.
Yeah, because I mean, there are always times when you have the stock going up so much, then there will be a time people will dump some to get the cash or cash out,
Mm,
right? So,
mm,
but in this case, I did look at some numbers, and I guess I'm not the only one. So the market must look at like a procurement manager surveys and unemployment numbers that trigger
mm,
the Sam's rule, etc. So the underlying number is not good, and
yeah,
that's why I guess Warren Buffett dumped a lot of stocks, right? And
yeah.
that's a pretty good sign.
It is.
Yeah, but.
I don't think that this was just, people profiting from
Mm-hmm.
taking out money, profiting in that way. It looked to me a bigger event than that. And there was a lot more panic than what you would expect if it was that kind of correction. This looks to me like, a warning sign that things are bad and that things are going to get worse before very long.
What will happen, I think, the Biden administration will do everything they can to delay this eventual
Yeah.
collapse of something. I
Yes.
think. Let's see if they can be successful, right? I
Yes.
also got the feeling that the bigger event is coming, but the question is how long they can hold on to. They have some tools, to continue
Oh
print
yeah.
money, etc. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah,
Exactly. They'll try to keep things together until the election
yeah.
in November, and they might succeed, of course.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. All right. Olympics. I don't know if you pay attention. There's a lot of discussions in the Chinese media, social media. First of all, why is swimming such an important game? Because there's so much, uh, you know, question about the Chinese swimmers. They must be using drugs, etc. Very typical, like this British swimmer, Adam Peaty.
Mm.
He said after he lost this 400 medley relay, he didn't, I mean, the British team didn't get a medal.
Mm.
And he said, well, there's no point in winning if you don't win it fair. So he's
Yeah.
implying that the Chinese winners are not winning it fair, but he lost to other people during this competition. He never said anything of other people. It's
No.
only when the Chinese athlete won this one. And not to mention, the Chinese athlete has been tested and tested way more doping tested than any other
Yeah.
countries. And even though it's always turned out to be negative, but so the consensus is there is some racist element to it. Do you agree?
Absolutely, of course I do. There's no question about it. I would add the Russians were the target of the same thing. I mean, if you go to the events of the Sochi Winter Olympics, where the Russians came top of the medal table, there was a major campaign, as I'm sure you remember, to prove that the Russians were won purely because they were taking drugs. And some Russian athletes were taking drugs, but it was nothing like on the scale that was being alleged, but it was enough to get them banned entirely from the Olympics. And it's racism. It's trying to keep the Olympics under Western control.
Mhm.
It's racism,
Mhm.
and especially strong against China. And of course, it's money. I mean, I think this is the other thing to say. I mean, if Western athletes don't win, they are not winning vast amounts of money that come with winning now. Now, that wasn't the case before with the Olympics. I mean, in the old days, which I can remember, when the Olympics were purely for amateurs, I mean, everybody laughed at it. We could all see that it wasn't really true, but it still provided a kind of restraint that prevented this sort of corruption from getting completely out of control. Because I do think a lot of this is corrupt now. I think it's basically um, athletes who, I mean, probably done all kinds of things themselves. I don't want to be too explicit. Have invested huge amounts of time, all of the rest, in pursuit of immense riches, very embittered and angry when these people from these Asian countries, these people who we feel have all these strong racial feelings against, come out and prevent us achieving those things that we want. I would not be surprised, by the way, if there's a campaign now to try to prove to China that the Chinese Olympic team is only succeeding um, because of drugs. Just
even though
what
they have,
what they
yeah,
did to
even
the
though.
Russians, they'll try to the Chinese. It'd be a dangerous thing to try to do
Mhm.
because China is so much more powerful, and I get the sense that netizens in China will be a lot more outspoken than people in Russia were, because the Russians had this enormous sense of inadequacy, especially at that time, in responding to things like this. But I would not be surprised if that's what we saw coming.
Even though I mean, this time the clearly the Chinese athletes has been tested way more than any
Absolutely,
other
yeah.
country. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and
Well,
they
why are they being tested more than other countries? Why is that the presumption that they need to be tested so much more than any other countries? I mean, if you think about it.
well, I think one of the things that they brought up all the time is that they claim
Yeah,
this 23 swimmers ahead of the Tokyo Olympic, they were tested positive. Well, they didn't tell you what happened was these 23 swimmers, this was a domestic Chinese swimming
yeah,
competition. And so China tested even for their domestic. If China really want to hide this thing, they don't even need to tell anybody. They
no,
tested in their own in,
yeah,
competition. And then when they saw this 23 swimmers were tested positive, they reported it both to WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency,
yeah,
and FINA, which is the swimming federation. So they informed them, and then they said, we are launching our own investigation. Their own conclusion is that the food
yeah,
has been contaminated, which caused all these 323 people
yeah,
are staying in the same hotel and they're pretty much eating from the same kitchen. But nobody is explaining this. They just
no.
claim, okay, there are 23 swimmers being tested cost positive. Well, why did China even report about this? They don't have to tell anybody, right? If they are part of trying to dope their own athletes. So
Well, there's that famous quote that's attributed to William Randolph Hearst: "Never let the facts get in the way of a good story." you have, you want to say that the Chinese are, corrupt and they take drugs, and that's the way they win. So you find that 23 Chinese athletes tested positive. You don't want to get a few things, simple facts like pointing out that it was the Chinese who found that out, who reported it, that it was then discovered that it was really because they ate food, which they shouldn't have done, and all that sort of thing. You don't want to talk about that sort of thing. The thing you want to focus on is the fact that there were 23 Chinese athletes who tested positive, full stop. That
mhm.
proves that the Chinese are bad people, not to be trusted, and are pure and perfect Western athletes would never, ever, ever, of course, do something like this.
One thing actually is what you're just saying, that they were trying to do something because next time it's going to be in Los Angeles, and the U.S. actually has a loss. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I never understand why the U.S. always have laws that reach in other country. Like one of the laws that basically allow the FBI to give the FBI the power to investigate anybody who, in their view, has been assisting, the using the athlete using the drugs, not to target the athletes, but the people they say
Yeah.
assisting the athletes, which means the FBI, even this time, they basically can invest anybody that they think is suspicious. Now, that
Yes.
gives them unlimited power to investigate, to punish anyone. That is very worrying. And I think even the Olympic committees are not happy about this, but I don't know how they're going to resolve this. Well, I mean,
Well,
just
it
like
is.
everything else, the US has this long arm jurisdiction, isn't it? Even in
That's
the
right.
sports.
Oh, that's absolutely. I mean, it's one of the shocking things, but the Americans do repeatedly claim that their justice system has essentially unlimited jurisdiction over everyone, everywhere, and all the time. And of course, this is a massive violation of the sovereignty of other countries. But the United States never accepts that other countries have genuine sovereignty. Of course, it insists on its own. You can't investigate
Mhm.
Americans in America, obviously, but America itself can basically do whatever it likes. That's the way they think.
Now, do you think swimming is a particular sensitive sport or something? Because it has always been dominated by white
Yes,
Europeans. And
yes,
so that's particularly got onto the nerves to some people.
Yes, yes, it's been particularly dominated by the Americans. I mean, if you look at the post-war period, it was the sports where the US was particularly strong. I mean, I can remember that throughout my lifetime. So China is now starting to win in an area in a sport where, as I said, the Americans feel that's very much their own. You know, it's their own territory, and many American swimmers, Mark Spitz, for example, is one who immediately comes to mind. National heroes for many people in the US, symbolic of
Mm.
American prowess and all that. So, if the Chinese come and start pushing the Americans off that particular pedestal, it's very, very upsetting and embarrassing to them.
Do you think that's another sign that United States is getting more and more not very confident? Because I mean,
Oh,
this
yeah.
is just a sports, right? It's it doesn't need to be so obsessive, but they are
It
getting
doesn't.
insecure, right?
It doesn't need to be so excessive, and it is getting insecure, and it does play a part. But again, you mustn't underestimate the importance of money. So, um, sports are broadcast in the US.
Mm.
Um, Advertising revenue comes from those broadcasts. How do you get Americans to watch? You get Americans to watch by showing them American athletes winning. American athletes aren't winning. Americans will turn off and watch other things,
No.
and the advertising revenue will dry up. So that is a very, very big factor now.
Actually, the U.S. netizens, I find it interesting. There's a lot of quotes from the comments. One of the Americans said this, which got lots of attention in China. It says, to be honest, if China had this kind of a drug that could escape 40 times tests in the past 7 days and help athletes break records, they would definitely give it to their soccer teams already.
Well, true enough. Oh, I mean, this is the good side of America. I mean, you do get lots of people like that who are very, very conscious of the absurdities and hypocrisies of their own country, and
Yeah,
more so than in Britain, by the way.
yeah. I mean, the Olympic become more interesting in that sense that it's got
Yeah,
so much drama, other than the competition themselves. So, yeah. So
yeah,
it seems like every time you and I talk here, once every week, either the situation in Middle East and Ukraine is stay where it is or getting closer to more danger, more
yeah,
escalation.
yeah.
Don't you get that feeling? It's
This
like
is
they're just
abs-
etching in now, right?
this is absolutely true, because and it's the same factors that are driving this. It's not just it's not so much that the Americans and the Western powers want to win. It's that they're terrified of what will happen to them if they lose, not because the Russians or the Chinese want to conquer the world. I
Mm.
don't think deep down any Western leader really thinks that. I mean, they've interacted with the Chinese many times. They've interacted with the Russians. I don't think that they think that. It's i- if they start losing in all sorts of places, then they're faced with the reality of the decline of their own power. And that is unbearable for them. The idea that the West is no longer dominant in the world, that it no longer shapes the direction of all of humanity, is something that Western leaders just cannot bring themselves to accept. And the result is that when things start to go wrong, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, before long, I fear, the Pacific, they start doing increasingly desperate and reckless things.
So I just want to, because what you just said make me thinking that ultimately I think the problem with the U.S. foreign policy and probably the Western foreign policy is this. On the one hand, they don't want to get into whether it's in Ukraine or in the Middle East, right? They don't want to totally draw into the send their own people, etc. At the same time, they can't accept Zelensky's defeat, and for whatever reason, they have to protect, Israel. So they have this. They cannot make up their mind, right? They
Yeah.
they want to support. them, but they also don't want to support. So that seems like is the heart of the problem. They can't make up their mind, right? Is
You are
that
absolutely you are absolutely right. On the one hand, they can't lose. I mean, psychologically, it is impossible for them to lose. On the other hand, they sense that if they were to get drawn further in, their problems would become impossible and that they would lose and lose conclusively. So the result is that they have foreign Western foreign policy has at its core this tension, which it cannot resolve. It's got no real answer to it. And it's one of the reasons why it is so chaotic and so disruptive, because it's and so unpredictable,
Mhm.
because you always have to worry about what the Americans are going to do, because the Americans themselves never really know what they're going to do, because um, they always hope and expect that the other side will back down. And when it doesn't, the pressure on them to do something else is very great, but they're never themselves ready to go all the way in a way that would put themselves at risk.
Yeah, and that makes it impossible for even other countries to help out. For example, even China wants to mediate something,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Turkey tried, etc. Even there are
mm,
those countries
yeah.
who trying to help. As long as this problem is not solved, that it's make it impossible for even other country to help out, to assist with whatever the mediations, negotiations. As long as the United States doesn't know, is not determined to put a stop to all this, right?
That's exactly correct. The United States will not face the logic of its own situation. The fact that since it cannot ultimately risk war, it should try to avoid war.
Yeah, yeah.
So the result is that when you're left with something like that, what can you do with a country that behaves in such an unpredictable and irrational way? As you correctly say, China. When the Chinese say that they're going to go to war, they mean it. I
Hmm.
mean, I remember I've when they say they're going to go to war over Taiwan, I absolutely know that they mean it. When the Russians say the same, I know that they mean it as well. By the way, going all the way back, I remember back in 1979, when there were tensions between Vietnam and China at the time over Cambodia. And the
Hmm.
Chinese said at the time, if you do this, we're going to respond. Well, there was never any doubt that the Chinese would respond, and they did.
Yeah. Hmm.
With the Americans, it is never like that.
Yeah, you never know,
You never know.
yeah. It's part of it is that within the United States, there are also different factions, right? Yeah, that's also, you never
Mm,
know who will be the upper hand, who will get to the upper
yeah,
hand. Yeah. All right. We will be watching then. We'll see next Wednesday what more happens in all
indeed,
front.
yes,
We will see.
indeed.
Thank you so much for spending the time. Bye.
Speak to you next week. Have a great time.
Thank
Okay,
you so much.
right.
Bye.